Hi, everyone. This is Tiffany Yu speaking. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the CEO and founder of Diversability. And I am a Taiwanese American woman wearing a pink jacket, joining you from the lobby of my doctor's office. But I wanted to just share what is on the screen right now. So as we let people in and welcome you to this event, we have a full screen flyer showing. At the top, just a point of admin, it says, please keep your mics muted if you are not one of the speakers. The flyer reads Diversability Unplugged, the power of the disability vote, followed by 5 headshots of our speakers, Neil Carter, Dom Kelly, Laura Minitello, Jess Moore Matthews, and Janessa Seymour. And then at the bottom is the a navy blue bar with the moderator, followed by my name, Tiffany Yu, my pronouns she, her, and a photo of me. And then there are also some additional details of the date and time of the event. And we also have ASL interpreters here, and cart captioning is provided as well. And this event is hosted in partnership with Rev Up. We'll share a little bit more about some of their work throughout the conversation, but I'm really excited that we are going to be hosting this event on what some of us have recently learned is National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And welcome all of our panelists. So with that, if our final speaker, Jess, oh, I do see you here. Let me go ahead. I see you. All right. All right, we have everyone. Also, one point of admin as well, if you have questions throughout the conversation, if you don't mind putting your question into the chat, but starting it with the letter Q, that will help us and the admin team all be able to see that that is a question and we can save them for the end. So I have some prepared questions that we're going to start with. And for those of you who are joining, if you'd like to include where you're joining in from, maybe you can also include if you're registered to vote. I'll include some resources around that as well. Put that in the chat and we can all say hello to you. But let's go ahead and get started. So we just want to ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves, your name, pronouns, a visual description, and what you do. So I see Neil first on my screen. So Neil, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Certainly, Tiffany, thank you. My name is Neil Carter, pronoun he, him, his. I am a black man sitting in a black chair with a black microphone in front of me, wearing a blue shirt and a blue jacket in a white office. I am the founder of the co-founder of Disability Victory. I am the principal of New View Consulting, and I am the founder of the Black Altered Group.
Thanks so much for being here, Neil. Janessa, over to you.
Hi, I'm Janessa Seymour. I am a voting rights advocate at Disability Rights New York. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit legal office offering free legal services to people with disabilities and part of the Protection and Advocacy Network. I am a white woman in my 30s with red hair and black glasses.
Thanks for being here, Janessa. All right, we'll say hello. Next on my screen are our interpreters. We'll wave to them. Laura, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Minitello, and like Jess, I'm also part of the PNA network. I'm the voting access advocate at Disability Rights Florida. My pronouns are she, her. Currently, I'm in my home office, but the background is kind of blurred. I'm a white woman in my 30s with curly hair, and I'm wearing a pink jacket with a black top.
Thanks, Laura. Dom Kelly, you're next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dom Kelly. I use he, him pronouns. I am the co-founder, president, and CEO of New Disabled South, a 501c3, and our 501c4 arm, New Disabled South Rising. We are a regional disability rights and disability justice organization working in 14 states in the southern US. And I am a white man with brown curly hair, wearing big rimmed glasses, a white collared shirt with a green and gray striped tie with some photos and some of my favorite records framed on the wall behind me. And I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks for being here, Dom. Fun fact, of all the panelists, I think Dom is the only one I've met in person in a city that he no longer lives in, that I now live in. And all right, Jess, you are closing out our panel. If you don't mind introducing yourself, providing a brief visual description and letting us know what you do.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Moore Matthews. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a Black woman, medium brown skin, longish dark hair. I got a haircut yesterday, so it's kind of freshly cut. And I'm wearing a yellow blazer and a white shirt. I'm sitting in my husband's little corner of our everyone room with a bookshelf behind us. Fun fact, he's an influencer. So this is like his, if you follow financial education, you would recognize this backdrop. So very specific. I am the founder and chief good troublemaker at Backbone Digital Leaders. We're a digital agency of Black women spearheading a revolution at the ballot box and beyond. So have worked with history-making candidates across the country, as well as organizations, many of which are represented today. Really happy to see my friend Dom, Neil, everyone. And yes, I'm also a new Just Tech Fellow. It's my first month as a full-time researcher, and I am focused specifically on mobilizing disabled organizers like myself, as well as voters ahead of upcoming elections. So really excited to be here.
Congratulations. I mean, so much I wanted to comment on. The new haircut looks great, the influencer husband. So I've got a couple different themes of questions that I wanted to go through, just to let all of our panelists know. They probably all know each other because the people who are either in the Rev Up network or doing work around the disability vote, it's a small and close-knit community. But part of why we wanted to host this in partnership with Rev Up was we wanted to introduce our audience to some of these issues and why this is so important. So the first category or topic is kind of more generally like why the disability vote. So the question is, can you briefly share your personal experiences or insights on why the disability vote is so important in the world we live in? And we're going to do this in a way where whoever wants to answer will unmute yourself, and then I will go ahead and call on you. So Jess, you're already unmuted, so I don't know if you were excited to answer this question first. But yeah, why do you have personal experience of why the disability vote is so important to you?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of us have the stats, so I'll spare you all for now in terms of how pervasive this issue is. And I'll just share a personal story. It was 2008, and I had just I just turned 18, registered to vote, and the presidential election was actually that following week. And I was just so excited as a newly registered voter to vote for, what would become the first Black president. And I signed up to knock doors in a very small town in rural Virginia where I went to college. And we walked for miles. We knocked on hundreds of doors, and it kind of just felt like, in some ways, an exercise in futility, because I don't know how many of us really thought we could elect a Black president. We were doing it, and we felt like we should, but it just felt really unrealistic. So imagine our surprise when the next night, the CNN is on and they're doing the electoral maps and they're zooming in to different parts of the country that are turning blue. And the final state that they focus on is Virginia, the state that we're in. And they zoom in and you see, our region, and they zoom in further and you see the streets we were door knocking on. And so when they called Virginia for President Obama and ended up calling the election, I mean, my mind was blown. First time voter, first time door knocking. And, it felt like we had just such a huge and historic impact. So my perspective on that experience is really core to my identity as an organizer. But what's also core to my identity as an organizer is about 6 months later, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And my perspective on that entire experience shifted, because so many folks I was meeting would not have been able to walk those miles that we did trying to get out the vote. And that community has been my community for the last 15 years since then. And that really informed my perspective on disability justice, on digital organizing, which is what I really focus on, and civic engagement in general. So that's my personal connection.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. It's, you know, you got to see the power of your vote and then had your entrance into the disability community, and I guess wanted to figure out a bridge to bring those two experiences together.
Absolutely.
All right, the question is, I'm looking, oh, Laura, Laura, you're muted. We're trying out moderating a different way. We're just trying to have fun. You know, we're talking about voting. But yeah, Laura, what about for you? Do you have any personal experiences of why the disability vote is so important?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to answer because I found myself nodding along as Jess was sharing her experiences. Also, as a person with a disability, who was really excited my first time voting that same, election, I had wanted to sign up to help organize, and I have a CP and I'm a wheelchair user, and I was told no. I was told there's not a place for you, like you can't go door knock, you can't go do these things. We're just sorry, no. So I think even more so than voting, I tend to think of it as a whole. The disability presence and disability, just our participation is important in the whole of civic engagement. So as Jess shared, it's not just the vote. Yeah, that's what we're trying to accomplish is the electoral process, but it's a whole process to me. And that kind of lit my fire as well for these issues. And now I'm blessed to work, on a policy level in them. But I think, that many of us have had those experiences of just that kind of this process being closed off to us in some way, where that's just a very personal experience that has then catapulted our professional ones.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Laura. I love the way that you talked about kind of where, not only in voting, but where some of the other barriers exist for disabled participation in wanting to get civically engaged. Neil, you're the next unmuted person. Do you have, and honestly, I love these stories of all of you remembering the first time that you voted. But Neil, what about for you? Do you have any personal experiences or insights on why the disability vote is so important?
Yes, of course. I won't say when first time I voted. I won't try to age myself. It certainly wasn't in 2008. But I do appreciate the folks that had that experience in 2008. For someone who's been in this industry for a little bit over 20 years, that will age me. I can remember the first time I voted in that the voting location, while it was a accessible location for me to roll my wheelchair up into, it wasn't ADA compliant, the polling location. So I had to flag that for the Board of Elections. But then also in addition to that, once I got into the polling location, the actual polling site itself where I actually got to vote wasn't accessible either. They had me take my physical ballot to a table they had set up that they had basically cornered off for, they didn't really specify for disabled folks, but they said, here's where you roll your chair up. And they had a kind of an accessible sticker on the side. It seemed like they kind of put that together right before I came in when I was in line. I just remember feeling very kind of singled out, despite the fact that everyone was kind of doing their own thing voting. And I know obviously there have been several changes to polling places across the country in terms of identifying physical, and in terms of identifying the lack of accessibility and addressing that head on. But in some other spaces, that's not the case, right? There are more spaces and more polling locations that are accessible than are. Despite the fact that we are in the 33rd year of the ADA, despite the fact that all of us believe point anybody out, but I can say that myself at least is part of the pre-ADA generation. And I can say that adequately that even though we have had the ADA on the books for the past 33 years, despite that, there hasn't been enough progress made as it relates to accessibility to the polls and in the polling locations, not just necessarily making polling place ADA compliant, because we know ADA compliancy, as we're dealing with in the Supreme Court, with the major case that's about to be heard against the Ascension hotels, we are seeing accessibility met kind of head on, right? We've seen examples of the ADA kind of bipartisanly being attacked and being pieced apart, which is unprecedented, right? And I don't use the term unprecedented loosely. So I think as the conversation transpires, that's important to highlight that it's make things compliant for the sake of the EA that is 30 years old is the floor. So many folks in this space, unfortunately, see accessibility, or I'm sorry, see ADA as ceiling when it's not.
Thanks, Neil. We're gonna talk a little bit about polling place accessibility in a little bit, but I wanted to. Oh, Dom just knew right away he got to take himself off mute. All right, Dom, would love to hear about you, personal experiences about why the disability vote is so important.
Sure. So, I'll start with I turned 18 like the year after Obama was elected, so 2009. I turned 18 and I was very sad not to be able to vote in that election. But I would say actually Obama being elected really was like politicized me, and also helped me see my own disability identity as political for the first time. I was born disabled. I have also cerebral palsy, so that was like the first time I was kind of politicized around disability. But I'm thinking about why is it so important? I mean, I've had my own experiences with polling places being inaccessible. I've had experiences where in 2020 where I showed up at a polling place, and because of probably more incompetence than malfeasance, I showed up at my polling place after recently moving, and on the government's website, it showed that as my new polling place, that I was confirmed. And when I showed up, they didn't have my information in their system. So I was asked to fill out a provisional ballot, where I was brought over to an area of this polling place where there was no chair for me to sit in. And the table was very low. And so I was forced to then bend over to fill out my provisional ballot, where the poll worker stood directly behind me and not only watched me fill it out, but talked to me the entire time. So my ability to vote privately was taken away from me. My ability to vote in an accessible way was taken away from me. And that was like quite minimal compared to the number of experiences that number of things that I've witnessed myself and also heard from disabled voters in Georgia, where I live, and across other states in the South where voter suppression is rampant. And so like that's a personal example, but I have also seen 10-hour-long lines at polling places where the lines cut through accessible parking places, and disabled folks can't even show up and park their cars to vote. I have seen the laws make it here in Georgia illegal to hand out food and water to disabled voters. Like, I know we're going to talk more about voter suppression, but like that, I think is one really motivating factor for our community to get out and show the power of disabled people voting. But even beyond that, in just being a part of these systems that govern us. Like if we are not out voting, we do not have people in power who think about or care about our community. And a perfect example is the 2016 election. I'm sure everyone can think about people in their local community, people in their state that have been elected who do not care about accessibility, who they've had to fight for funding for things like home and community-based services, or whatever the issues are that impact our community. The fact that we still in 2023 have to fight for those basic things, to me is such an indication that like it is critical for our community to get out and vote, and at the same time be cognizant of the fact that it's not so simple to just simply get out and vote, that it's also not enough to just get out, to ask people to get out and vote, especially in our community. And I have lots of thoughts and ideas and things that we're doing to been thinking about to increase civic participation in our community. But I'll stop there, and I know we'll probably get more into that.
I sent all of the panelists suggested questions, and they're like 50 of them. I was like, ooh, what about this? All right, and just Janessa, let's close it out with you. Do you have any personal experiences that kind of made you really passionate about the power of the disability vote?
Yeah, so one thing I think is always important to think of here, I think people tend to think of disability, the disability community as like this niche minority group, and like the disability vote as, oh, it's this one little niche interest. But the reality is that a lot of people have disabilities that are invisible, that you don't see. And a lot of people may have a disability that they don't recognize or that they don't identify that way. As we age, who isn't going to acquire a disability as you gain, joint pain, cognitive aging symptoms? It's coming for all of us, right? So if we're not voting as if disability issues impact us, we're not thinking carefully about what's really going on. I wasn't diagnosed with ADD until I was 26. That doesn't mean I magically had ADD at 26. I was a child with ADD, and I was a teenager with ADD, but I don't think I was voting as if I was a person with a disability who needed resources and maybe could have benefited from better resources as a child that I didn't get. I wasn't thinking that way because I didn't have a diagnosis. I didn't have a community that I was identifying with and part of. So yeah, I think it would be really important to get that out there, that disability is not like this 1% over here. It's, according to the CDC, it's 25% of New Yorkers have some sort of disability, according to, whatever legal definition they're using. And that's pretty similar to the national numbers. So yeah, we're a lot bigger of a lot more powerful of a voting group than people might think.
I love that you close on that. We're more powerful of a voting bloc than people think. And I heard someone use the term pre-disabled, and I just thought that was great. We're either disabled or pre-disabled. But before, I know everyone is always excited to talk about voter suppression, but before we get there, I do want to talk about wins, because I think the majority of you shared experiences at your polling places or other barriers, or experiences that just weren't accessible to you in the process of voting. And so I'm curious if any of you have any examples of positive initiatives or strategies that have successfully encouraged disabled voter participation. Because right now what I'm hearing is, I don't want to go to a polling place. Neil, it's the race to unmute. Let's do Neil and then Dom.
Sure. So I think one of the barriers that was immediately met with the, we kind of, the first year of COVID, 2020, and we saw the reintroduction of mail-in ballots, right? That was the primary way in which voters across the country democratically voted in the 2020 election cycle. And while that is a reasonable accommodation that disabled people have to do with, I saw Mark indicated that he voted absentee this year via electronic mail in the chat. That's just one, and I don't want to use Mark's example as to pin, but that's just example to say that happens regularly, or it became a reasonable accommodation for everyone in 2020, where despite the fact that that one side of the aisle treated mail-in ballots as this new thing that no one had ever heard of, was infallible, it was untrustworthy, ballots would get lost, infractions are going to be made, voter suppression going to happen at unprecedented levels. And then we're seeing what happens with folks who make those claims, and we're seeing where they're ending up, right? I don't need to go into the detail because those who watch the news know what's going on. So if you don't, you can find out. But for me, I think not just with introducing mail-in ballots and making them a reasonable account, and recognizing that they're a reasonable accommodation for everyone can mail a ballot. I think also organizations like New Disabled South, organizations like Disability Victory, that are talking about electoral justice, whether New South is doing it hyper-focused in 4 states, Disability Victory is doing across the country in ways that haven't been seen previously. And while our organizations are relatively new, obviously nonpartisan organizations like Janessa, for instance, have been around for a long time, have been trying to at least in New York, have been trying to make the right to vote accessible, right? But also so specifically thinking about even for me, even at a granular level, just making right to vote this commonplace idea for disabled people, right? So I think so from an organization standpoint, we have brand new organizations, existing organizations, and then in 2020 the recent accommodation of mail-in ballots, while disabled people have been using mail-in ballots for decades, right? The fact that everyone across country was mailing their ballot for the most part. I mean, there were some people who were running the risk of potentially getting COVID while going to their place. A majority of the country was mailing in ballots. So I think that is a major win. And the fact that folks are taking that into consideration for future elections after 2020 is also a win as well.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I often think about, even outside the voting realm, the way that the pandemic opened up a lot of pathways for a lot of us with disabilities to get access to remote work and things that we had been advocating for a long time then became a reality. Dom, what about for you? Some positive, some wins that have successfully encouraged disabled voter participation?
Yeah, so this is what our approach at NDS is going to, and NDSR is going to look like. But I'll, prior to doing this full-time, I worked on Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial race in Georgia as her senior advisor for disability, and on that race built out a field program specifically to turn out disabled voters. So we had across departments, not just in our field program, I had 9 people on the disability engagement in my department, and then we had a dozen at least paid community captains in the disability community who were paid regularly to engage with disabled voters in their networks. So that was one strategy, right? It was we also had the resources to be able to pay people to work on this campaign. But more broadly, in that work and other organizing work I've done, and I think this goes for most marginalized communities, not just disability community, that at this point in time, we talk about voters being apathetic. I really don't believe that voters are apathetic. I think that voters are disenfranchised. I think that people are continually let down by those in power who make promises time after time and don't follow through with those promises, and their lives are not getting better. People are still being evicted from their homes. People are still struggling to put food on the table, to pay their bills. So it's not enough to simply ask people to vote and to tell them why it's so important to vote. And I think that is broadly where voting, electoral organizers and in the voting space we've reached a point where we have to change course. And so what the Abrams campaign did broadly, and what we also employed with disabled voters, is the campaign had a constituent services department. So while we were out door knocking, those door knockers were also talking to people who were about to get evicted from their homes in a week. So our constituent services department were able to get them connected to resources so that they could stay in their homes. So like those were the kind of issues that our organizers were working through. And campaigns don't have constituent services departments, but there have been really thoughtful organizers here in Georgia who have been building out that kind of model of electoral organizing for a while. And we did that in our disabled voter GOTV program, which we helped get folks connected to resources that they needed to just simply survive. And people said that they felt supported for the first time in a long time. And the way Stacy put it on our campaign is that we're gonna govern even without being governor. And like that is a beautiful way that I think we as organizers can think about our work. And it's what I want to continue and build upon and scale at New Disabled South is, of course, we need to turn out voters and prove the power of this community of ours, but that we also need to be able to show up for people and give mutual and like organize mutual aid efforts and like do all those things that actually make improvements so that people can feel empowered to then go out and face the countless barriers in the way for our community, because it takes time and money and energy to be able to jump through those hoops and hurdles. If we want our people to do that, then we have to support our people, because government ain't doing it for us. So like we got to do it. We got to save ourselves. So I think that I've seen that be successful, and my goal and mission is now to try to scale that. And especially in this moment that we're in, where we're coming up in another presidential election, and I don't see the excitement. I don't see I see burnout. I see people tired of elections. I see people tired of commercials on TV and being asked for money and being asked to go out and vote. And like, we have to show up for a community in a different way. So I've seen it work, and I think it can continue to work, but we all got to be on the same page. And that's a goal of mine.
I love that, Dom. And I really appreciate that perspective that, even though voting is an individual act, it happens in community, and knowing that you have a place that you can turn to for resources or to, and we'll talk a little bit about like disabled voter rights and, how to know where to go find those resources that I think you and the work you were doing with Stacey Abrams had done a really good job of. And now the question around like, what does that look like at scale? Laura, all right, over to you. Hold on, let me read Oh, go ahead.
I have so many thoughts. Just listening to both Dom and Neil. First, I agree with both of you, but I agree with you, Dom, that it's not just that we're seeing apathy. It's that, particularly, and I'll just talk from personal experience with disability for a minute. There's the barriers that we all know are there, and I'm sure that we will touch on later in the conversation. We have to give people a reason to vote, and we have to give people a reason that supersedes those barriers. So One of the things that's always interesting to me is if you look at the little bit of research that we have coming out of Rutgers with Lisa Scher and Doug Cruz, they've actually found that the disability community is more engaged than the average population civically. So that I think speaks to the fact that it is the very real barriers, not a matter of apathy. And then Neil, when you were talking about specific how COVID changed the way that we vote and the way that we do a lot of things, I thought of our Florida Council of the Blind, who during COVID, a lot of those folks couldn't get to the polling place, and they looked in Florida statute and saw that for about 20 years, accessible vote by mail was in Florida statute, and not implemented. And so it ended up in a lawsuit where, and as a result of that, we do have accessible vote by mail in every county. We're still fighting for a turn, but that to me was a huge win that we had in Florida. We are in Florida, so we have to, and I'll clarify just before I say that these are my own opinions, not necessarily the opinions of DRF, but I think that we all know, especially being in this space, the challenges that those of us in Florida and some other states are facing. So I wanted to highlight that win, and it's something that we even still are trying our best to amplify as the PNA and as our Rev Up Coalition and voting advocates in Florida, is that the accessible vote by mail is available in all 67 counties, because it's not been as utilized as it should, as we'd like to all see it be. Not that should be the only way that people vote. You know, as we've all touched on, we have the right to private and independent votes and voting in the same way that other people do, whether that's a polling place, and we all know the barriers there, but it is a win that we've seen in recent years.
Thanks, Laura. I also want to co-sign a comment in the chat from Olivia that said, not too many wins in Florida. We celebrate them when we get them. But I think one of the things that was really fascinating about what you shared was that it was in the statute, right? And it was because people weren't aware of it that they didn't know that they had access to voting in that way. So being able to both, I guess, elevate the consciousness that is available, and now being able to roll that out statewide is really impressive. All right, Jess, over to you. For people just joining, we are currently answering the question around some of the wins that have really helped to encourage disabled voter participation. And if you do have a question, if you want to put it in the chat by prefacing it with the letter Q, we'll make sure to get to that in the Q&A. Jess, over to you.
Yeah, I personally was very encouraged in the last presidential election by the actual focus and intentionality that some of the presidential campaigns had around a disability platform. I should just go ahead and shout out my candidate, Elizabeth Warren. I was the mobilization director for her in Texas. And I don't know, it was heartening to see a plan from someone that was not just a plan, but a plan that was influenced by disabled people. I just spoke yesterday with Vilissa Thompson, who talked about how she contributed to this plan. You know, Julian Castro was someone who put out a plan. And while they may have been in the minority, because there were a lot of people in that race, I feel like it's going to become a standard. I think having a disability platform, specifically like what Dom described, Stacey Abrams was doing in the last gubernatorial race, is going to be expected. And I think it has to do with folks like people who are here today being vocal and demanding answers to questions that candidates need to answer. And I'd like to think, if I'm being optimistic, that even at a more down ballot level, candidates are starting to think about these issues thanks to the work of their volunteers and organizers. I'd love to hear about more examples of that happening, further down the ballot.
Thanks, Jess. Janessa, anything you'd want to add? Or did you go already?
No, I didn't. I think one of the successes we had over here in New York that I was pretty proud of. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with, I'm sure people are familiar, at least on the panel, with the Help America Vote Act. For people who are joining in, there's a complaint process built into it. So we have our HAVA complaints that we can file through that. And we've been over the years filing them and getting some results back from the state board, and it's been getting better and better, getting more attention. We filed 9 complaints this year and got a favorable determination in every single one, where that was a whole variety of problems, from ballot marking devices that weren't functioning, poll workers who weren't familiar with disability etiquette, poll workers not providing the proper assistance for voters who didn't want to use a ballot marking device. And every single time the state board found in our favor that the county boards of elections needed to be doing better in training their poll workers, in providing better equipment, in improving how that experience went for voters with disabilities. We even got one county that was a repeat offender is going to be monitored by the state board for the next 3 years because they've been having such consistent problems. So I would definitely encourage people, if you can get out there and file those complaints. State boards are listening. At least in New York, our board, I mean, we've had a overall positive experience with them really listening to these complaints and it going pretty well. So yeah, I think we've had some big wins on that.
Yeah, honestly, that's the first time I've heard of that. If there's a link, even if it's just for New York, so people know like what to search for to be able to file those complaints, I think again, and we're going to transition our conversation and talk about what everyone I think came revved up to talk about, which is voter suppression. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about, here, I'll just read the question. It says, could you explain how voter suppression laws target disabled voters? And what are some effective ways you or your organization are countering these efforts?
I'd love to start.
Yeah, go ahead, Dom.
Boy, we are in Georgia. Feels like ground zero for voter suppression these days. And I mean, we've seen it across the country, like since the 2020 election, on the backs of the big lies that have been, conspiracy theories that have been floated about the 2020 election. And so because of that, I mentioned before, SB 202 here in Georgia was a bill that passed and signed into law by Governor Brian Kemp, that banned, for as one example, passing out food and water at polling locations to voters in line. Actually, not only banned it, made it a felony. Now that a judge just blocked that last week, actually. And so for the moment, it is acceptable to do in elections. I want to shout out Zan Thornton, who is on this call, who has done a lot of really incredible work here in Georgia. Zan's talking about rides to polls, which we worked with Georgia Adapt on during the runoff election last year. Zan has done so much voting rights work, but there's a lot of barriers in the way. So that was one of them that for now is sort of like not an issue. But also that same judge said that SB 202 did not violate disabled voters' ability to vote absentee. And there were a number of barriers that got put in the way of disabled voters being able to vote absentee. The limiting of ballot drop boxes in the state of Georgia. The law says something like you can only have one in a single county. So like if you're a disabled voter and you're living in Coffee County, for example, and there is one ballot drop box and you do not have accessible, affordable transportation, you do not possess the ability to drive a vehicle, you can't get to that ballot drop box. It also may be a financial barrier for you to have to go out and buy a book of stamps, because here you have to actually buy stamps to stamp your own ballot. So there are like numerous ways that seem, maybe to your average voter to not be a huge issue. It's like, well, okay, how much does the stamp cost? But we know that disabled people live in poverty at twice the rate of non-disabled people. So, a book of stamps is quite expensive. If they don't have gas money to put in their car, they don't have a car at all. How are you getting to return your ballot drop box? There's also plenty of laws in across the South that have made it now a felony to have someone assist you with returning your ballot. So I believe in Georgia and a couple of other states, there are provisions that say that only a caregiver can help you return your ballot. And that caregiver, if you're living in, for instance, a nursing home, if you're institutionalized, which our people are still institutionalized, the person that you're the worker at your nursing home may not legally be able to assist you with returning your ballot in a ballot drop box, because they would consider that to be ballot harvesting. I mean, just obscene, like really terrible laws that I think a lot of people wouldn't think about from a disability lens. Another one that I think is really important that I've been trying to like scream from the rooftops lately, is we don't think about less obvious examples of voter suppression, right? We think about like voting by mail, we think about long lines of polling places, accessible voting machines, and all of the ways those are inaccessible. But elections administration, and the like overtaking of these elections administration systems, like that is a huge issue that is impacting our community. And another example from Georgia is that they just made it a felony for elections offices to receive private money from private foundations. So if you've heard anything about the stuff with Mark Zuckerberg, he donated money to the a big foundation that basically sent money to polling places, and the polling places are typically underfunded. So that money helped them to do things like make sure polling places are physically accessible for disabled voters. That's where actually a large majority of that money would go to. Now it's not only illegal, it's a felony. So if an elections office takes that money, people are going to jail. So now they don't have the funds because they're not getting them from the government. And so these polling places now are either going to just be inaccessible, or most likely they're going to be closed down because they're inaccessible, instead of how do we find a way to fix them? Because in 2018, the then sitting Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, who was overseeing his own election for governor, tried to close down a bunch of polling locations in a primarily black county in rural Georgia, saying that it was because the polling locations were not ADA accessible. Disabled advocates, voting rights groups, all raised hell. They stopped it from happening, but polling places close all the time because they are not ADA accessible, rather than investing the money in making them accessible or changing their locations. So that's just an example of what's to come. It's going to happen next year. We are going to see polling places across this region and across the country close because they're not accessible. And a big part of it is because they don't have the money to make it accessible. And it's an issue that people are not connecting to disability, this elections administration takeover that the right is trying to do, but it's really detrimental to our ability to vote accessibly.
And I think what's so interesting about what you shared, Dom, is that it's under the guise of disability rights saying, oh, we're closing it, when in reality it's targeting and negatively impacting multiple communities and multiple voting blocks. Neil, what about for you? And I also wanted to, don't forget the second part of the question, which says, what are some effective ways, you or organization are countering these efforts? Go ahead, Neil.
So I'll start with ways and resource that there are a number of national organizations that make it their make a strong effort to kind of address voter protection at a national level by having voter protection hotlines. And those voter protection hotlines oftentimes are they can be PTY accessible. They can be and multilingual, not just bilingual, but multilingual. And I'll start there by answering that question. So I think and there are several organizations that have national hotlines, and then there are a few organizations that do state level work. But there are a number of national organizations that have voter hotlines where you can call it on election day and talk about what's going on as far as, if your vote is being suppressed, and then they will literally go out and investigate that immediately, and also provide you resources so that if your vote is potentially challenged, you can find the resources to argue for your vote and advocate for yourself. So some ways in which and I was thinking about some of the stories that I heard, because sometimes I'm asked, as someone who's been, again, in this industry for 20 years, sometimes they ask for partisan standpoint me to sit on the Democratic line and then help from a disability standpoint assist with finding resources for folks in particular states. And some of the calls that I've been on, I've heard disabled folks from across the country. One major thing I'm never going to forget from several cycles ago in 2006, there was a disabled person in I want to say Colorado, I think, who was voting first time, and they were told at their polling location that it was by an election volunteer. They hadn't even gotten into the polling location yet. The electioneer, who's working for a candidate, electioneering side, told this potential voter that their SSI or SSDI check was going to be revoked if they voted a certain way. Now, for those of you who are on SSI or SSDI, you know how important it is to get those checks every month. So imagine you're voting for first time, and you literally hear an election. This is not even a poll work. You haven't even gotten a chance to vote yet. But someone literally tells you, if you vote one direction, then your SSI or SSDI check is going to get taken away. And that's just one example, right? I've heard your assistive device is going to be accepted in this polling location. I've heard, I've seen and heard situations where assistive devices have attempted to be taken away from someone trying to vote, right? And literally been taken away so they can't stand up or sit up or see the actual ballot. So there's all these different ways in which voter suppression kind of in a intersectional way, and Dom highlighted one way in Virginia, or I'm sorry, in Georgia, where that's key. But in seats and jurisdictions where it's mixed use, urban and rural, that is incredibly a high level. In New York, in Colorado, where I mentioned before, in where I am in Maryland, also in neighboring DC, in the District of Columbia. There are places across the country where, unfortunately, what's happening at a local level is progressive, liberal, Democrat, conservative, moderate, and Republican, try on the gambit there, are all unified in what they think accessibility looks like. when it comes to accessing the polls. And oftentimes they think ADA compliancy is just making sure that there is a ramp in the polling place. Now we all know that having a ramp, again, as I mentioned before, that's the floor. That's not the ceiling. But when it comes to accessibility, and when it comes to particularly when it comes to ADA compliancy at polling places, that is another form of voter suppression, where the assumption is, as long as the polling place is quote unquote ADA compliant or not, in the case of polling places across the country that meet ADA compliancy, if it doesn't have ramp, it's not ADA compliant. If it doesn't have 2 or more accessible parking places, then it's not ADA compliant. In my view, there should be at least 8 to 10, but that again, that is the floor. And we're in 2023, y'all. It's not 1902. We are in 2023. We are about to face, and I know folks on our side of the aisle like to say we are facing the next election, the most important election of our lifetimes. Every election is the most, for disabled people. Every election is the most important election of our lifetimes, because if we aren't at the table, it's that saying, we're on the menu.
I wasn't sure how you were going to finish that. So if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. All right, Janessa, Laura, Jess, any of you want to share any strategies or things that you're working on to help combat some of these voter suppression measures that are going through now? Jess, over to you, and then we'll do Laura.
Sure. I have 2 ways that I am attempting to do my part this year. One is a personal way. I've signed up as a poll worker. I'm so excited. I am, yes, going to serve my community, but also kind of going to audit. I'm really curious, like, what the behind the scenes looks like. I had a similar experience to Dom, actually, as he was telling his story. I had to also fill out a provisional ballot. It wasn't clear why last time I went to vote, and I have questions. So I'm going to be taking a lot of notes. I'm going to look very studious, but really what I might be doing is tweeting out some of the things that I'm finding and reporting, to the county what I am seeing. So that's number one, which is a small thing, but I think on this National Poll Worker Recruitment Day, if you have the ability to sign up, please do, because we need more of us in those polling locations. And then the second thing that I am attempting to do is hold folks accountable publicly. I am going to be auditing a lot of the different digital organizing apps over the next year or so, and also auditing some of the campaigns that are really out front, and getting it right when it comes to accessibility, but also getting it wrong. I think it's really important that we shout out folks who are doing it well so that they can be an example to others, but also think it's important that we call out folks who are getting it wrong, which, I've struggled with that a little bit, because as I've been looking, some of your faves on social media are just not accessible. It's really painful to see. And so maybe it's a DM, right? It's not full public shaming, but there are a lot of folks who need help. And I think in my capacity with Backbone, my agency, maybe that's something that we will be doing more publicly. One of my favorite accounts on Twitter is this New York Times. I don't know how many people follow the New York Times typo account. But they actually reply under every single tweet that the New York Times posts with like every typo that's in the article. And I would bet that the New York Times is actually more typo free because of this account. They always catch something. They literally always catch something. So maybe we need an account like that for accessibility that, responds to everything someone puts out there, and lets them know where they've messed up.
So are you building that?
I think so. I'm getting lots of nods. Maybe I need to do that. Yeah.
I want to help you.
She's not.
Yeah.
not for free. She's not.
Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah.
Maybe Rev Up has some grant money to help get it kickstarted. All right, Laura, over to you.
It's hard to follow you all because you all said such great things, and just I want to piggyback off of all of it and highlight DRF's work as well. We've kind of touched into the website accessibility space as well with audits of each of the 67 supervisors of elections and the main register to vote website, which we will be continuing in 2024. So that is a kind of organizational way that we are going to help hold people accountable. Also, I feel like, Dom, you're in Georgia, we're in Florida, we're kind of just in a race to see, voter suppression, who can come up with more voter suppression laws. But I thought it was such a great point in that not everything is targeted at the disability community, but affects us, and ADA compliance is certainly one of those things. And I think even in DRF's poll site surveys, so DRF is with a lot of the PNAs, does poll site accessibility surveying every election cycle. And that's something that we've been careful in our work to provide, to be sure that we're not providing I'll use mine, these are purely Laura's words, not DRF words, but to provide the excuse to close polling places, that we're providing remediation of possibilities for these polling places where we do find issues. And as Neil said, that's kind of the floor. And then as well, I also just wanted to take a second to highlight DRF's own voter hotline, which we have live all year long, particularly at election time, but all year long. So it's a statewide hotline. And we do have Spanish translation available as well. But if you're having any issues as far as polling place accessibility or just questions, our staff is more than happy to answer that. I will drop that in the chat for you all. And then, if it's not a question that we can answer, we are happy to work with you and provide whatever resources we can, just to make sure that these issues I know they're on all of our minds, constantly working in these spaces, but we want it to be more of a constant in the public's mind as well, and not something that, you see a lot of times people think about elections, during election time, and our work has really ramped up at DRF to make this more of a constant conversation. So having our voter hotline available all year round is one way that we're really trying to support that effort.
Thanks, Laura. Janessa, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I feel bad rubbing it in after all that, but in New York, we just passed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is one of the most comprehensive state laws at this point protecting an individual's right to vote. So very excited about that, to hopefully have a law that is going to prevent some of that voter suppression. A lot of that is targeted at preventing suppression on the basis of race and language minority groups. But there's also a lot of provisions in there that are really general, that just say, hey, when you're interpreting election law, you should interpret it in favor of the voter, in favor of ballots being cast and counted. And I think a lot of that can be interpreted to protect the rights of voters with disabilities, to protect the rights of women voters, all kinds of voters, making sure that voting rights are protected in New York. So I will say, on the books, New York voting rights are looking pretty good. And our accessibility laws are pretty good. They're pretty strong on paper. This year, Disability Rights New York, we worked with the Brennan Center for Justice to do poll site surveying, and we surveyed 179 poll sites, early voting poll sites around the state, and 94% had some sort of accessibility violation. And that's between looking at the state laws, the accessibility, the Americans with Disability Act, accessibility rules, putting all of that together, 94% violated in at least one way. The good news on that is almost all of them were things that would be quick fixes with a little bit of funding or, you know, a little tweak to the polling place. It's not things that we're going to require massive changes to the way that elections are run or completely picking a new polling place. A lot of times it was something so simple like the access aisle parking in the parking space didn't have a sign saying no parking. And you can fix that with a traffic cone and a piece of cardboard, and it just wasn't done, but it could have been. And it's in the guidelines that it should have been. It says how to do that. So on paper, we're looking really good. In practice, it's not always happening. And I think the good news is putting that report out there, you know, we got a pretty good response from the state board that they found it concerning too. And fingers crossed that'll go somewhere, that we'll get something done based on bringing this to light, bringing it to people's attention.
Yeah, that 94% number is staggering, but not surprising. And I feel like what you said, on paper, it's looking pretty good, but in practice, not so much. Also reminds me of Neil's comments around the ADA as well. Laura, I see your hand is up. Did you want to add something here?
Yeah, I know we're going to talk about polling place accessibility a little bit later, but because it was mentioned, I just wanted to echo with our numbers as well. Our numbers are about that and about 85 to 90%. DRF did about 500 polling place accessibility surveys, but between early voting and election day. But that said, Florida has about 6,000 polling places that are open during that time. So, I mean, again, to echo that, you know, there are a number of those things could be fixed very easily. We're looking at things like one of the things that was most appalling to me was we saw a lot of tents in the no solicitation zone in the handicap parking. In multiple places, we found that people would just park their tents out and take up 2 or 3 handicap parking spaces. That is not something that needs to be. I mean, none of this is things that need to be happening, but that is such an easy thing to prevent. And we have had some success as well. We were able to present to the Florida Supervisors of Elections, and we're really hoping to be able to work with them as well as to expand our capacity to do these surveys. But I just wanted to echo those numbers because they're you know, appalling and they're easily fixable. And then the second thing was I saw that my colleague at DRF, Maddie Crowley, our amazing social media specialist, also put our accessible vote by mail brochure resource in the chat. So I just wanted to take a second to uplift that. And thank you for that teamwork, Maddie. I appreciate it.
And it's interesting because we keep saying we're going to discuss it later, but we're almost at time. But let's actually talk about poll place accessibility. Here, hold on one second. This is what happens when you take a Zoom call from your doctor's office. But part of why we actually partnered with Power the Polls. I am a former poll worker supervisor from 2019 in San Francisco, was that we wanted to make sure we had someone on the panel who could speak to poll place accessibility. So that is actually how we got introduced to Laura. So Laura, I wanted to turn this over to you. What access should be available at a polling location, and what do you do if something isn't accessible?
Well, I have been immersed in poll place accessibility, and I feel like both Dom and Neil actually did a good job of explaining that as well as Janessa. But there are, there are a number of things. So at DRF for our surveys, we utilize the ADA checklist for accessible polling places. And so that covers everything from the parking lot and the presence of enough accessible parking spaces, which it's anywhere. It's one space per 25 spots. In Florida, actually, it goes above ADA standard in that all of the parking spaces have to be van accessible. So that is not the case everywhere, but all of our spaces have to be wider and have to have that extra wide access aisle. A few of the other more common things that we see that are not accessible, that are sort of easily fixable, are doorknobs versus handles. That was a big one in Florida. So to an accessible polling place will have either a handle, which is easier to grasp, or the door propped open and somebody just able to assist that voter and open the door. Shockingly, a lot of times you'll see a polling place, the accessible entrance locked and not open beyond certain hours. That is not okay. And then, as Neil shared, there has to be a certain number of accessible voting machines available. So that's 2 per polling place. And a lot of times what you'll see with those is, yes, they have them available, but nobody may know how to use them, or sometimes they're not plugged in, or they also have to be placed in such a way to provide a private and independent vote. So they shouldn't be facing doorways or anywhere that somebody may be walking by and able to see what somebody is casting and putting on their ballot. And that's an issue that we see a lot, is that they're just not placed in the right place. They're placed on tables that are too high, with drop boxes as well. So sometimes you'll see a drop box placed in an area where you have to navigate grass or rocks, or sometimes, in Florida, we have drop boxes that can be placed on at a number of different heights. So you'll see those placed on tables that are way too high, that obstruct the reach of somebody in a wheelchair. And then I think beyond that, one of the bigger problems that we face as well is that poll worker education. So I don't know, and maybe some of you all can speak to the training in other states, but our training, frankly, just hasn't been updated in a number of years, and is also really not standardized, in that you can go into one place and they can be really adept and really accommodating and kind of go above and beyond these basic accommodations. And then you can go into another where they don't know how to use the accessible voting machine. They're not interested in serving disabled voters, or there's just a number of things. So what do you do in that case? Honestly, I think our answer as DRF would be to call our hotline, and the more immediately that you, or one of those national hotlines, and the more immediately that you can do that, the better, and we're able to then advocate on your behalf, hopefully with an SOE or somebody that can assist you. I don't know if somebody has, Neil, I see your hand, so I don't know if you wanted to add specifics to what you've seen, but that's kind of some of the more egregious things that we've seen in Florida.
Thanks for sharing that. Neil, did you want to add something here?
Yes, really quickly. I wish there was some research on this panel about polling places and about electioneering from a disability standpoint. Jess, you may know somebody who's doing polling specifically. Yes, I'm teeing you up about polling places specifically about accessibility at a national level that could be funded, Tiffany, that could be funded to actually do this level of training at a national level. Partner with Janessa, partner with Dom, partner with me to do this partner with to do this training at a national, but also at a state level. I see several state partners here as well, but to do it at a national level, because Laura, right, it isn't, unfortunately, that level of training isn't nationalized. So many, to Dom's point earlier, some polling places aren't, the level of accessibility is at the floor. So they think all I have to do is check off 1 or 2 boxes, and this polling location, this polling site is accessible. And then in some cases, like in the case that Dom indicated in Georgia, they weaponize two marginalized against each other, or attempt to. And there will probably be more examples of in the upcoming 24 election and beyond, because there have been some recent attacks on what fully defined is ADA compliance. As we navigate that, and as we look to eventually Jess's research on a particular topic and the work we're all doing, I think that level of training does need to be standardized across the country, and I think we all work together to make a reality.
And that's why I'm actually excited that, Jess will have this experience as a poll worker I have, because we also need representation at that level, disability representation at that level, so that it can be incorporated and, I guess, put into this national training. I don't know if it's appropriate to call this a speed round, but I want to turn it over to audience questions. We have a handful. We have 3 in our queue, and about 13 minutes left. But for our panelists, I was curious, this was my own question, but what are some rights that disabled voters have in the voting process that they might not be aware of? So we'll do like a lightning round. Is there like one thing that, go Neil?
They have every right that an able-bodied person does.
Here in Georgia, and I believe probably elsewhere, you have the right to skip the line. If there is a line for voting, you can go right to the front of the line, and most people do not realize that.
I didn't know that. Thanks, Laura.
The right to an assistant of your choice, with the exception of your employer or your union rep.
Janessa, Jess, did you want to?
Yeah, so an important one that is often hidden in the back of the room, unfortunately, is the ballot marking device. So in New York, where otherwise most people are using a pencil or pen and paper, there is an electronic machine. It has headphones. It can read you the ballot if you are blind or have low vision. It has a paddleboard for if you have decreased dexterity in your hand, or if you have no hands, you can use your feet by putting it on the floor. It has a sip and puff device to navigate the menu. It is awesome. It has a million features, and I swear there's one in every polling place in New York. You just might not have noticed it.
Yeah,
I guess.
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I don't know if this is specific to North Carolina, but definitely check your state's rules on curbside voting, because that's huge here in North Carolina, and it's definitely under attack as well.
That lightning round was so fun. Oh, Laura, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of that and mention, shameless plug, that DRF and Access to Vote Florida, a RevUp coalition, partnered on videos to showcase ballot marking devices, and the Express Vote and the Image Cast, which I believe are 2 of the most used nationally. So I will go ahead and drop that resource in the chat as well, or send it to you, Tiffany, to send out with the recording. But if that could be of any help to our attendees.
And Dom, I'm just seeing when you write it's been banned in certain states, is that the ballot marking devices?
I was referring to what Jess talked about, curbside voting. They've done away with it in certain states since 2020, especially. I believe Texas is one of those states that had it and got rid of it, sadly.
Yeah, we've just
Texas
never
still
had it
has
in New
it.
York.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that we still had it at my polling place in North Carolina last year. So I'm definitely keeping an eye out.
Yeah, and I want to thank Jeremy. Jeremy Demick had asked about experiences with ballot marking devices, so it's great to know that that they're available. All right, so now we're going to move over to audience questions. We have one from Maddie Crowley, who asks, how do we better reach voters with disabilities living in rural areas, especially as organizing for disabled community is pretty online and Wi-Fi/internet isn't universal? Jess, I feel like this question has your name on it. And if it doesn't, then if there's someone else who wants to
Can you
respond.
repeat it? Can you repeat it one more time? I was reading the chat.
No worries. Yeah, and the chat is very exciting. Everyone's very excited. Right. So I also pasted it into the chat.
Oh,
It
perfect.
says, how do we better reach voters with disabilities living in rural areas, especially
yeah.
as organizing for disabled community is pretty online and Wi-Fi/internet isn't universal?
This is good. Yeah, I would say don't underestimate the power of a good text bank. Texting, it can be done often without Wi-Fi, and it can hit a lot of folks who are just relying on self-service. Also, I would say, you know, we are, whether we like it or not, still in a pandemic, and folks are in person. And so, you know, there's something to be said about reaching folks where they are. And if you feel safe enough in a mask, like getting folks to record what they're doing, share it with their friends and family. My favorite social media platform is iMessage, and organizing your family and friends is, I think, honestly, one of the most powerful things you can do, specifically in rural areas. I'm still disappointed that I remember when I found out that my brother did not vote in, I believe it was 2020, and he didn't even have a good excuse. And I made him the person who had to come with me to the polls last year. I picked him up and we had a plan. And I mean, make sure that everyone in your network has a plan to vote. And I think if more of us did that, relational organizing, we would actually reach more people than we realize. So that's my first thought.
Dom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think another thing that we had success with on the Abrams campaign that we are actively doing at New Disabled South is just, mentioned reaching voters where they are. That includes voters who are living in nursing homes, who are in group homes, other congregate settings, where they're often not contacted. People are not going door to door. They're not hearing from candidates. Like I brought Stacy to a group home in Macon, Georgia. They had never met a candidate. None of the people who lived there had ever met a candidate. And we had it was a small group of us. It was me, Stacy, and the small group that lived there. And we had a really powerful conversation about the issues that impacted their lives. And they had never, it was the first time that had ever happened. And like, that is not, so much of electoral organizing is about quantity, right? It's like, how many doors did you knock? How many calls did you make? Like, how many voters are returning out, which is critical, but quality is missed when we are focused on the quantity. And so like being able to actually be in places where people are and talking to people about the issues that matter and reaching them where they are in rural areas, in places where people aren't knocking on doors or making calls or sending texts, those are just critical. And we've also been having conversations about this idea of like deep canvassing, and deep canvassing is really about like long, personal, one-on-one conversations with people that aren't just, I knock on your door, I have a 5-minute conversation and leave you with some lit and then I leave and I mark you off. This is like real sit down conversations, and that kind of organizing can move the needle. And so we should be doing that in places that aren't metro areas. We should be going out to places that don't have broadband internet access to be able to actually have those kinds of like deep personal connections.
Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just be really quick. There are some great GTV tools, some of which I've shared Jess and for her research, that are in a post-pandemic space, but just acknowledging disability in general way from a GOTV standpoint, finding virtual ways to revert organizing, where in some cases they will send a text message to the potential voter, and that text message will include a video link. You can actually video chat with the voter from the safety of your home, and interact with them that way. So there are new tools that are being introduced, some of which are being incorporated into some of the more popular GOTV tools. But there are tools but there are ways organizers, disabled organizers, are connect with not just disabled voters, just people in general, to get out the vote or in support of a particular candidate.
Thanks for adding that, Neil. And Janessa, it looks like you want to say something, but I'm also going to tack on this question to your additional comment, because I know you mentioned it earlier. It says, does HAVA as a federal law have legislative power to fight local or state level voter suppression laws?
Yeah, so the thing I was going to say about this contact issue is just something I've been doing a lot lately, is like, don't reinvent the wheel. There are other organizations already doing it. So there's an independent living center out there. There might be an ADAPT group. There might be a self-advocacy network. So like just hooking up with them instead. You know, I'm the only full-time person in our voting rights division, so I can't do it all by myself. I have to get other people on my side. So that can be a great way, is just find the person who's already doing it and team up, is great. As far as HAVA goes, so it is the Help America Vote Act is a federal law, but it does explicitly govern what the states are doing, because ultimately the states are the ones who administer our elections. So technically it only applies if there is a federal race on the ballot. So like in these odd year elections where maybe you're not voting for House Representative, Senator, President, federal ballot. I don't think we do federal ballot propositions really. But technically it wouldn't apply. Realistically, it wouldn't make a ton of sense to like come into full compliance and then only do that every other year. So it tends to work pretty well across the board. Maybe not so much for your school board elections, but certainly on any election where there is a federal race on the ballot, it will apply and govern what your state board, your county board, and your local board of elections are doing. They are required to adhere to it because there's a federal election on the ballot.
Thanks for adding that. And we have time, I think, for one last question and one last person to maybe one or two people to respond. So Tiffany asked, how can you show how a single vote has impact? How does it make a difference? She is a first-generation voter as a fourth-generation deaf. Anyone want to take that one? How do you know that your one single vote has an impact? Janessa.
So we have I could dig these resources up. It would take me a second, but there's a really cool series in this video we use of all the times a single vote decided an election. And there's even one where it was a tie, and these two people had to draw numbers out of a hat in front of a judge to figure out who was going to win. So when it comes down to your local elections, it literally can come down to one vote on a regular basis, actually. It can easily come down to within 50, 100 votes. And those local elections can be some of the biggest, most important ones. You know, for example, think about like your sidewalks. how big a deal your sidewalk is if you have any sort of mobility disability. That's not decided by the president of the United States. That's decided by like your city council, how well that's funded. So those local elections where maybe only 1,000 people are even eligible to vote for that, it really could come down to 10 votes.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I think I dropped a link to an article that's mentioning what Janessa talked about, but I think anytime an election is close, it's a reminder that one vote can decide an election. I know I was so stressed last year watching the Warnock results come in, and I was like, they were counting one vote at a time, and you can imagine like one single vote. And finally, from the internal campaign side, I was just talking with Dom, I think this week. I mean, these local races, you have to come up with a win number. These win numbers are like sometimes in the hundreds for local candidates, right? Sometimes a candidate only needs 305 votes to win. And so when you think about that, you could be number 305, and you could be the reason why the main street by your house finally has streetlights, which is something that I'm getting ready to fight for at my city council. So, it matters so much, but especially at the local level, which is where you're going to feel that impact the fastest.
Laura, did you want to say something in like 5 seconds?
Absolutely. I mean, echoing all of that, I think that's all really valid and kind of was going to piggyback of what I was going to say. But also, I just, as a person with a disability, I like to think of it in terms of advocacy and self-advocacy. And I think it's also a valid thing to say that if that vote is important to you, then it's important, and to really think about what the reasons that you yourself are voting. And so it may or may not come down to that single vote. We don't know, but you won't know unless you cast it.
I love that. Yeah. And we're unfortunately going to have an abrupt ending here, but I wanted to say, Neil, Janessa, Laura, Dom, Jess, this was an amazing conversation. I learned so much. I can't wait to dig into the links. For everyone who registered, we're going to share the recording and also the chat so you can access the resources. A special thank you to our interpreters and our captioner for staying a couple minutes over as well. And I will see you all over at the polling location, at the accessible polling location, and online. You can follow Diversability across a lot of different places. Thank you so much again, everyone. Have a good night.